Motion prevails. The Senate stands adjourned. Have a good year.
The 2013 legislative session has adjourned. We evaluate in this week's Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. All-day kindergarten, legalized same-sex marriage, and $2 billion in new revenue. These are some of the key elements that define the 2013 legislative session. This legislature was tasked with resolving a $627 million budget deficit, but chose to utilize the all-DFL majority to advance its priorities. They included $2 billion in new revenue, a 2% income tax increase to the top 2% income earners, health care reform, early childhood scholarships, and college tuition freezes.
In the last election, what I said I would do in the 2010 election, we increased taxes, revenues progressively. Most of it comes, about half of it comes from raising the fourth tier to 2% on the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans. That's a progressive tax increase, and we use that money along with the rest of a $2.2 billion increase to cover the deficit. That's $627 million to increase our commitment to education from early childhood all the way through post-secondary. That's $735 million, $400 million in property tax relief, $90 million in jobs and economic development. So those four categories alone are $1.85 billion of the $2.2 billion.
Senate Majority Leader Tom Bakk joins me now to encapsulate the end of session. Thanks for joining us. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator, it's only been less than 12 hours since session wrapped up, but having a little bit of time to digest it, what do you think the message was?
Well, Governor Dayton was asked after the November election, you know, what's one-party control going to be for Minnesota? What should people expect? And he used one word. He said progress. And as I reflect back on the last 5 months, I think we delivered on just that. I mean, we made some significant investments in early childhood and all-day kindergarten for every child in the state, money in our K-12 system, special ed, significant investments in our higher education system at the University of Minnesota in Minsk. Enough investments so that we're going to have a 2-year freeze on tuition at those institutions for our young people that are getting their education, getting their skills so that someday they can enter the workforce. Significant investments in job creation. We've made the expansion at the Mayo Clinic possible, and over the next 20 years they're going to add 30,000 jobs in Rochester. Major expansion at 3M here in Minnesota, and other economic development projects. The Mall of America is going to continue on their expansion to basically double their size over the coming years. So it's pretty exciting. And then, of course, my favorite topic is taxes, because that's where I've spent most of my time in the legislature. We did some significant sales tax reform and really, really significant property tax relief.
And let's talk a little bit about that. What can Minnesotans expect? It's not the check that the governor had initially proposed. What's the final package?
Well, there's a significant amount of new money going into the property tax refund program that people are familiar with. There's a significant amount of new money in local government aid to cities and counties, and that has an inflator built into it, so they're going to continue to get more money down the road. And the Senate pushed very hard from the beginning of session to reduce some of the reliance on property taxes to fund schools. So in the tax bill, we're carrying a provision where the first $300 of voter-approved levy that a school district has, the school district can just levy that. They don't have to go out to the voters. And then there's a significant equalization where if a school district has very low tax capacity, the state is going to pick up a significant portion of that cost. We've had this growing disparity in educational funding across the state. Districts that have a lot of tax capacity are doing very well. They've got voter-approved levies up in the $800 a pupil area. And then in other districts in the state, and I believe there's 47 of them, that don't have a lot of tax capacity, they have no voter-approved levy. So there's this huge inequity in school funding, and this provision allowing a school board to levy the first $300 and the state come in and help pay the cost of that is a significant educational reform, especially for districts that don't have a lot of tax capacity.
And I have a couple of questions for you about the tax provisions. One is, You personally have been a proponent, strong proponent for years about expanding the sales tax and lowering the rate. That was on the table early in the session. It came off later. Was that a disappointment for you personally?
Well, I've tried for a number of years, you're right, to move more towards a consumption tax, and for a couple of reasons. And I think what people need to remember is income taxes, even though they're probably more popular, fall only on Minnesotans, only on people with Minnesota earned income. That's who pays income taxes. So when you have a system that's heavily reliant on income taxes, it all falls on your citizens. When you have a system that is more consumption-based, like on the sales tax, people that come visit our state pay it. Businesses pay about 46% of the sales tax that we collect now. So the business community pays a lot of it. So it really gets shifted to the corporate bottom line in wherever corporate offices are, Wells Fargo in San Francisco, or Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas, or John Menard in Wisconsin. Much of our sales tax burden ends up being exported out of the state, so it doesn't all fall on Minnesotans. So from a tax policy standpoint, even though you'd think that an income tax is more fair, really good tax policy also contains another component. Can you export some of it so that it doesn't, your tax system doesn't all fall on your residents? No, I was disappointed. The Senate passed a tax bill that expanded the sales tax to a number of services and other items, and we reduced the rate to 6%. We were not able to prevail at the end on that. We weren't able to lower the rate, but we did do some significant sales tax reform this year. And there are provisions that have been around since I was elected to the legislature back in 1994. Every single year that I've been here, bills have been introduced that say, cities and counties, why are we collecting sales taxes on them? They have to raise the property tax in order to send a sales tax check to the state. We just eliminated it. So for the first time since 1981, local units of government are not going to pay sales taxes anymore. That's $100 million a year of savings to local governments that I expect is going to be passed on in the form of property tax relief. And the second large component of sales tax reform we did, same thing. Ever since I came to the legislature, bills have been introduced to say, why do we, when businesses make capital equipment purchases, why do we collect a sales tax, and then 6 or 8 months later we allow them to apply for a refund? And a lot of businesses don't have the accounting staff, and they never even make application for the refunds. So finally this year, in the context of this sales tax reform article, they did not lower the rate, unfortunately. I would like to have done that. But we extended the sales tax to some business services out there, and we were able to exempt cities and counties from the sales tax and able to make an upfront capital exemption for businesses that are buying capital equipment. Now that was expensive.
And you've been talking about that for years as well.
Been talking about it since I got here. So there's two major components of tax policy changes in the tax bill that I think are very, very popular with the public.
Okay, our entire conversation could focus on taxes, but let's shift a little bit. I do want to ask you, the GOP, of course, contends that the message of this session is it's overtaxing, overspending, overreaching. House Speaker Thiessen stated in that news conference earlier today that he would say for the last few years, the last decade, the state's been underperforming. What are your thoughts?
Well, since 2002, when I came to the Senate, in every single budget we've had since then, for more than a decade, a new legislature has been elected. They've came to the Capitol, they've got sworn in, they found out, hey, the previous legislature, they left me a deficit. I've got a problem to fix right away. We don't have a balanced budget. And finally now, after more than a decade, the next legislature that's elected after the 2014 election are going to have a budget where the books are balanced. And they're not going to immediately come in and have to manage a financial crisis of the state. I think it's the most responsible thing that was done in this session. We put a budget together with no accounting gimmicks, no shifts, no borrowing, an honest budget that balances for the next biennium, and I'm incredibly proud of that work. It is just irresponsible for one legislature to kick the state's financial problems down the road to the next one that's going to be sworn in.
In your opinion, will 2013 be known as the labor session?
You know, I think it's probably too early to write the history of this session, but I think probably this is the session that probably gets remembered for marriage equality.
Okay, with those words, oh, I did want to ask you a quick question about the use of social media with the legislative session. It seems to have exploded over the years, and a lot of what was happening over the final hours between the House and the Senate was all over Twitter. It was all over Facebook, as well as things prior to that. In your opinion, Knowing that you're not a big social media user personally, but do you think it's changing the way the legislature works?
No, I don't think it changes the legislature, but I do think what it does is feed a lot of information to the public that's not accurate. Because especially in the final days, people start speculating and guessing, well, what are the leaders doing? You know, what's being connected to what? And things always get connected, even between a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. In the final negotiations, a lot of things get connected as you try to work with the minority leaders in both the House and the Senate. The four leaders get together. And of course, everything is a buzz. Nobody knows what the four leaders are doing, so there's all this speculation going on and all this Twitter traffic traveling around and Facebook messages going around. And it's really mostly speculation. So a lot of disinformation gets out to the public. What people, I think, probably don't know is over the last 2 days of the session, the Speaker and I and both Senate and House Minority Leader had multiple private meetings, just us, to figure out how we could bring the session to a timely conclusion, how we could make sure that we got the money for the Capitol so the Capitol renovations can continue, because that takes a bipartisan vote. And fortunately, we were able to find a way to accomplish that. So there was a great deal going on between the four leaders, and of course there's rumors galore around the Capitol about what is it they could be talking about, what are they linking, and most of what you read on social media in the final days of the session is not accurate.
Okay, Senate Majority Leader Tom Bakk, we could talk for the entire program, but that wouldn't be fair. So thanks for your time, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
The E12 education bill is considered a marquee piece of legislation. It was signed into law just 2 days after session concluded.
We will require each school board to prepare a report in consultation with residents regarding the progress that is being made on a number of benchmarks, particularly third grade. Are the students literate, proficient? That's always been an important milestone in the journey. We'll ask for reports on that annually, and adjustments can be made in terms of what's being done if there's not sufficient progress.
He made the case on behalf of the Senate GOP during each floor session. GOP leader Senator David Hann sat down with us during the waning hours of the legislative session to give his perspective on the work done. Senator, at the time of this taping, session is just about to wrap up. So working under the assumption that everything passes by the midnight deadline, the tax bill, the legacy bill, things that are still left on the Senate table, what do you think the message of the 2013 session will be?
Well, it obviously depends on who you talk to. I think if you talk to me or someone in my caucus, I think the message is one of overtaxing, overspending, overreaching. We think the DFL came in and have passed a very, very large budget, a lot of spending, very little, if any, reform in that spending, lots and lots of taxing and increasing revenue and fees in other ways, and a lot of overreach in terms of some of the policies that they've put in place. And I think it's excessive, and I think that the people of Minnesota are not going to look at that as a favorable result from what they expected in the election. And so I think it's likely that there will be some price to pay for that in the next election cycle.
Senator, the E12 bill was debated this week, and the Senate is very, very proud. The Senate DFL is very proud of that piece of legislation. You were very passionate on the floor, not a fan of this legislation. You gave a lot of reasons, but why don't you encapsulate for our viewers why, and what kind of bill would you have liked to have seen? Well,
the K-12 education piece of the bill, of the budget, is huge. It's about 40%, and it's been that way for a long time. And it's a significant part of the budget, and I would argue perhaps the most important thing that we do in state government. It's the reason why I got into politics, was because of education. And it's important, and I think that we need to bring reform to what we do, and simply spending more money and calling it reform doesn't work. And we've been doing that for as long as I've been here, and that was one of the things I talked about. Since the time I came 10 years ago till now, we've seen the spending in the K-12 budget increase by 34%. It's grown 1/3. And yet we're talking today about the same problems and the same issues that we were 10 years ago. We still have the achievement gap. We still have kids that don't graduate. We still have the same problems, and we hear it year after year after year. And this is what is so frustrating. I think many of us know that there are good schools, there are good charter schools, there are good private schools, there's good public schools. We know there are models that work, but we don't seem to have the political will to create the conditions to allow those things to happen, and we need to do that. And I think the big elephant in the room is we know that this is probably partly a problem because of the education unions that have so much influence over the legislature.
You don't think fully funding voluntary all-day kindergarten is going to make some kind of an impact on the achievement gap?
Frankly, no. We've had all-day kindergarten in place for a long time in the state. If there had been a huge impact as a result of that, we would have seen it already. Most school districts already do a significant amount of all-day kindergarten.
But not the districts that have the most significant achievement gap, St. Paul and Minneapolis in particular. So do you think it could make an impact in those districts?
Well, again, I have not seen any research that would validate that, and we have had a significant amount of all-day kindergarten going on in the state. That to me does not seem to be the answer. I think that what we need to do, I believe, is empower local school boards, local school districts, empower parents and families, get the decision making close to where the action is, rather than centralized decision making here in St. Paul or, God forbid, in Washington, D.C., and expect that that's where reform is going to be driven from. You got to have decision making done close to where the education takes place.
Do you think the per pupil funding increase will be beneficial?
Well, I think that it can be if you empower the districts to be able to use that money and manage it appropriately. I don't know that we've done the things to allow that, but I don't think it's bad to put money in the formula and give school districts an opportunity to make decisions about it, but we haven't done the things on the other side of that equation to free them up to make decisions how to use that money.
And moving on from that, obviously we've talked about some of the components that you don't like, your caucus does not like, but were there a few bills that you do? We talked about this last week, but anything this week? You voted unanimously on the Senate floor in favor of a very small bonding bill to help with the Capitol restoration. So that's one example of where some consensus was. Are there others?
Sure. We had and I can't remember now what day this was, they kind of all run together, but we had a pretty broad consensus on the final vote on the Judiciary Public Safety budget bill, for example, which again funds the activities of the courts, and I think there's been a longstanding agreement that over the past several years we need to do some things to make sure that the courts are well funded, and as a constitutional obligation, I think most of us take that pretty seriously. Senator,
as a longtime member of the Senate, we were talking a little bit before the camera started rolling about the role of social media during the legislative session and Twitter, and you know, my impression is there were more tweets, and I could be wrong about that, but I've noticed more, and I've noticed that they seem to get a little more, people are specifically targeted instead of just one party maybe knocking something the other party is doing. Does the use of social media, in your opinion, change the legislative makeup, change the way things are negotiated and perhaps the work in general?
Well, it does. I think it does change things. I think it used to be when people had something to say to somebody, they would go and talk to them, tell them in person. Unfortunately, now what happens is people go off and they say something on a social media outlet and it kind of gets spread around, and that becomes a substitute for actually going and talking to somebody. If you're mad at somebody, you've got something to say to somebody, it used to be you'd go and talk to them. And that, I think, is a way to resolve a problem. You go and confront someone and have a face-to-face, and you know, maybe you're mad or you got a problem, you can get it sorted out. If you go put something on social media and it kind of takes a life of its own, and kind of all you do is you create ill will, you create rancor, it kind of has a multiplying effect. I don't think this is a great idea. I think there is a lot of it, maybe a lot more of it than there used to be. I don't think that's a positive thing, and especially in this environment when you've got a lot of people doing a lot of different things and there's a lot of frustration, and especially at the end of a session, I'm not so sure it's a great idea.
Senator, you're about to go fly around the state. What do you think you're going to hear from people all around Minnesota?
Well, we're going to, I'm sure, get a lot of advice on what we did and what we didn't do. I suspect we're going to hear people not particularly very happy about all the taxes and all the effect that's going to have on their lives, the increase in spending that they're going to have to come up with in their personal budget to account for that. So I suspect we're going to hear some frustration from people, and we're going to be listening very closely.
And last time we spoke, you told me you don't drink coffee. There have been a lot of late nights here. Have you started to drink it yet?
No, I have a cup of tea once in a while, but you know, I don't know what it is. I don't need a lot of caffeine to keep my activity level up high, so I'm fortunate in that way.
Okay, Senator David Hann, thanks for joining us. We appreciate your time as always.
You bet.
to provide an academic perspective on the 2013 legislative session, we have Dr. Larry Jacobs from the Humphrey Institute. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Good to be back with you.
Dr. Jacobs, it's early on after session, but how would you encapsulate the message of the 2013 session?
Strap on your boots, lots of work, lots of legislation. I think we're kind of back to the kind of activism and, if you're looking for a more neutral phrase, productivity from lawmaking that we saw decades ago.
How so?
Well, of course, during the Pawlenty years and then during the Ventura years and during the Carlson years, you had a lot of vetoes, you had a lot of deadlock, disagreement, and we just saw a steady decline in the number of bills, the amount of lawmaking that was being done. This is, as one DFLer put it to me, this is the new good old days, meaning that there was a kind of resurgence of lawmaking that we hadn't seen probably since the mid-1970s.
And having an all DFL legislature and governor, the Governor Dayton was asked about it, governing with that kind of a legislative makeup, and he stated one word. He just thought that this session could be wrapped up by saying progressive. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think this was clearly Democratic-led, Democratic-leaning, and the governor, I think, was probably the biggest winner. The beginning of the session, he came out with a tax reform, of course, and laid out some other agenda items in his State of the State address. I think you go through that, you'll see that he achieved a lot of it, and his particular vision, let's say on tax reform, is very close to what was actually passed by the legislature, and more so the more you get into the fine print. For instance, there's been a lot of talk about sales taxes not going anywhere, but I think if you get in the fine print, you'll see these business-to-business sales taxes and the fees actually amount to quite a effort on part of the legislature and the governor.
Let's talk a little bit about policy. From a policy standpoint, what would you consider the most significant piece to pass this session?
In my view, without doubt, it was health reform. There's a whole lot there, and obviously it was quite partisan, but there were also ideas there that we'd seen Governor Pawlenty and previous sessions of the legislative branch working on that I think will become the cornerstone of the healthcare delivery system and financing system, and the kind of thing that will be worked on for decades to come.
I'd like to get your opinion on the GOP's thought of the message of this session. They concur, or they believe that the message really is overtaxing, overspending, overreaching. What are your thoughts on that?
There's no doubt that this session provides plenty of ammunition for both the Democrats, who are going to talk about raising taxes for concrete things like particularly education spending, and the Republicans are going to come back and talk about the broader message, which may actually meld with some of the controversies in Washington about too much government. This is a session that is kind of ready-made for Republicans to go to voters in 2014 and say, tax and spend Democrats are back, and here you go, and they'll point to particular parts. I think the hard part of this debate will be who shows up in 2014. If it's the electorate that showed up in 2012, which was frankly more friendly to Democrats, then I think the DFL will win. But if it's the electorate we saw in 2010, when there was obviously a takeover here by the Republicans in both the Senate and the House, I think the Republicans will find plenty here to mobilize their forces and to do quite well in taking back the House 2014.
Dr. Jacobs, although this was a budget year, there were obviously significant policy issues to come through the legislature. In your opinion, do you think this will be known? Do you think the legacy is as a budget year, or do you think it'll be because of policy?
Probably both. Clearly the policy changes on gay marriage, on the symbolic step on unionization of child care workers and personal health care attendants, and health reform are going to probably put a big stamp. And I think, in 10 or 20 years, when my colleagues and I are writing the history of this session, those would be some of the things that people stand out. And, it'll be pro and con. We'll have the perspective of hindsight. My hunch is these are probably, particularly on the same-sex marriage and healthcare reform, the kinds of things that last.
Was labor underscored this year, in your opinion?
Oh, this was probably the best year for organized labor in 4 decades. The Clearly, the unionization battle on child care and the personal health care attendants, it's about 12 to 21,000 voters out of a workforce of about 2.5 million. So it's not going to change the workplace, but I think symbolically it's such a dramatic contrast with what's happened in Wisconsin, where collective bargaining rights have been rolled back, that I think that'll stand that as a symbolic step.
You've been following the legislature for decades, so how would you encapsulate the dynamics of this session, particularly those last 6 or 8 hours when things were kind of at a standstill? Is it kind of business as usual in your opinion, or is there anything that stands out?
I would say this was kind of a stampede for the lawmaking books, and at the end there were some choices that the DFL leaders had to make about which cattle were going to cross the finish line. And there was some jostling there, and I think I was here last night, and there was a lot of excitement about what was going to prevail and what would be left behind, perhaps for the 2014 session. But I think stampede. You have lawmakers, the DFL side, who have been waiting for a generation to move this legislation. Once you had a DFL government, you saw them basically getting on the horses and saying, now's why I've been sitting here for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. Giddy up and let's charge. And a lot of those bills came down to last couple nights whether they would pass.
I want to ask you one last question concerning social media and the use of it during the legislature. And it seems to have exploded, and it seemed to take on a different tone this year than it has in the past. There was a little more calling out of other people instead of just shots towards another party. So do you think that social media is changing the way the legislature works, changing the landscape of how things are done? The negotiating, because things are publicized.
Yeah, the idea of a backroom deal, it's going to be harder and harder. There were tweets when there would be a spotting of Leader Bakk meeting with Speaker Thiessen, and a lot of speculation as to what they were going to be talking about. And so no, the backroom deal is all of a sudden people are staring in the windows. They don't know exactly what's being said, but they have a good idea. I think this is a new era, and it has upsides and downsides. The upside is there's more transparency. If you want to follow what's going on minute by minute, and I have to admit I became an addict of this, you could do it. And it didn't mean you had to kind of come up here and talk to people. You could follow it wherever you were. The downside is, there was a lot of spinning, and there was, some sharp elbows that were thrown. It wasn't always, kind of proper decorum. And I was tweeting, and I took some sharp shots to the chin. It's fair enough, but it's a more bruising and not always particularly accurate way to kind of follow what's going on here. That may be playing into legislature and how some things got played out. Also seemed to really mobilize the troops. We saw some very raucous demonstrations here. Absolutely appropriate First Amendment sort of things, particularly unionization in the last couple of days, but same-sex marriage moments. And I think social media was very helpful and efficiently calling out both sides of that debate.
Okay, Dr. Larry Jacobs, we're out of time, but thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you again.
That wraps it up for us again. Until next week, have a great week, everybody.